The Earth is Biosphere 1. This is Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 is an incredible tool in the hands of amazing scientists
that is dedicated to understanding the effects and impacts of global climate change.
To help us anticipate what are the possible responses of landscape-scale ecosystems to major changes in the dynamics associated with climate, particularly water and temperature.
So the consequences of global climate change, which the UN has already warned us about in the most explicit of ways, we can study here. And we can also think about how to ameliorate those consequences.
So the culmination of the changes of the climate over the past 3.5 decades I've been here are really coming to bear on us in very harsh terms right now.
When we think of the Earth, we think of Earth systems, all interplaying with each other. And that's precisely what happens here at Biosphere 2. You don't just look at a system in isolation, you can link them all together to see what happens.
The key is to be able to adapt. In order to be able to adapt, we have to understand what's coming our way. Without a facility like Biosphere 2, it makes some of those predictions much more difficult. But we really have an opportunity to provide insight in ways that other facilities can't, but very much complement the world's observatories and laboratories.
There's this incredible combination of the ability to do very large-scale, yet controlled studies on uniquely controlled ecosystems. There is no place else like it in the world.
Some of the conditions that we currently see facing us, whether it's the increased temperature in coral reefs, the droughts in tropical forests, increased desertification, they're happening right now, and they're continuing to progress.
Well, here they are running those exact experiments to see how those systems will recover.
Each of these systems can be precisely controlled so that we can conduct experiments to understand the impacts of global climate change.
You go into a laboratory like B2, and you're saying, here are the factors that we think are driving this change. And we can then monitor those, or model or alter those parameters, CO2, temperature, et cetera, other trace gases in the atmosphere, and then see what happens and see if indeed those changes in those parameters in the atmosphere in B2 translate to a change consistent with what we're seeing in the field.
Biodiversity loss is a true crisis. Emitting carbon into the atmosphere is a true existential crisis. If we don't do both of those at once, while maintaining some kind of equity or trying to make sure that what we do doesn't make inequities in the world worse, we are on our way.
Inside Biosphere 2 is a tropical ocean system. And what's unique about this is we can control all of the variables. We can control the temperature, we can control the water chemistry. And this system is different from your typical aquarium in that we are willing to push the boundaries of this system to understand the response of the organisms. And not just a single organism, but the entire community.
So unfortunately, as you all know, we are in really dire straits and at risk of losing our coral reefs entirely if we continue to do nothing about climate change. So today we've estimated to have lost already about 50% of the world's reefs. And so we're really at the point as a coral reef community where we need to really be moving into action. And so we have really developed innovative solutions for restoring what we call resilient reefs. So reefs that can persist through climate change and disturbances. It may not look like the reefs of today, but will still provide that critical goods and services to humanity. Behind me is a really unique opportunity to actually test those solutions before they're applied in the wild. In my work, we've learned that corals that do get hit frequently by stress events, so they get warming frequently, tend to do better when these warm events return. So they then bleach less severely during subsequent events. So we can actually use that to our advantage and do something we call stress hardening, which is we turn up the temperature, we stress the corals out, and we increase their resistance to temperature stress. We can then restore reefs with these stress-hardened corals, and those corals are more likely to survive subsequent heat stress events.
The Biosphere 2 rainforest is 35,000 cubic meters. It's 28 meters at its tallest point. It has over 100 plant species, and we can control every variable, from temperature to carbon dioxide to even the rain that's starting to come down right now.
I've been studying tropical rainforests for 20 years, mostly in the Amazon of Brazil, but also here in Biosphere 2. And these are fully assembled ecosystems. But what we really are able to do now in Biosphere 2 is to start from scratch, to build the Landscape Evolution Observatory, which allows us to assemble a complex ecosystem from scratch. And here we have the Landscape Evolution Observatory, LEO, our laboratory for understanding how ecosystems function.
So it rains in the mountains. How much water ends up downstream? What impacts the quality of that water? These are questions that we struggle with every day. The Landscape Evolution Observatory was specifically designed to try to shed light on some of those critical questions. As a landscape evolves, how does the movement of water change? As you add vascular plants, how does that further complicate the system? And can we actually develop tools that allow us to better predict, so people like water managers and city managers, for example, know how much water they're going to have as we move into the future?
The optimistic story is that biological systems are resilient, more resilient than we have often imagined, but that there is a limit to that resilience. And if we don't act soon to stop the changes that we're imposing on this globe and this planet, then we will lose the opportunity that biology is giving us to save it.
All around us, we've been able to see these different climate pressures show up in our natural ecosystems, and more we're hearing about how climate change is impacting things that we need to live, the food that we want to eat, the water that we need to grow that food, and the energy for heating and cooling. In this system, I like to say we're harvesting the sun twice. In the overstory, we're collecting renewable energy, and it's providing shade for the plants growing below. The plants are growing in that shadier environment so they don't get that midday stress that really harms plants, really slows down their production. In exchange for that, just like we perspire and lose water and it cools off our skin, plants transpire, and that cooling of the atmosphere actually cools the solar panels overhead, which makes them even more efficient. And the last part of that is the shade in this environment reduces the evaporation of the moisture from the soil, which means the water stays in the ground longer and does the work that we brought it here to do, which is grow plants. One of the biggest benefits from agrivoltaics comes in terms of water savings. And we've found by growing food in this agrivoltaics environment, we can cut back half the water and still not see any impact in terms of the production. So what that tells me is that we can cut back more than half the water before we start to see real reductions. So we haven't even seen the full potential in terms of water savings. And so in terms of what's next, in our next spring growing season, we're going to switch up our irrigation system and have it be plant driven. You know, when the plants draw down that soil moisture, our soil moisture sensors will detect that, and that will trigger the irrigation. That'll be the way that we actually calculate how much water does it take to sustain food in an agrivoltaic system versus a controlled system.
One of the important things is the question, is there hope? And I think the lesson from biology is, yes, biological systems are more resilient than we give them credit for, and we're learning all the ways in which biology has ways to cope with stresses and problems of climate change.
Biosphere 2 offers an opportunity to understand, first and foremost, what is the resiliency and the boundaries for some of these systems. But it also provides information of ultimately where are some of those tipping points.
And I have hope because I have seen reefs recover. I have seen evidence for reef recovery, but we need to give them that time by addressing climate change and coming together as a coral reef community to develop some of these solutions in real time.
There is absolutely hope. We are an adaptive species. We are seeing that the systems inside Biosphere 2 are showing us that in some cases they have greater resiliency than what we had initially anticipated. And because of that, that does give me hope. But just because we have hope does not mean that we can stop these efforts. We have to continue to forge forward and understand the implications. What are the resiliency and those boundary layers for these systems? Because knowing that is going to allow us to adapt and make changes to allow us to have long-term sustainability.
I have hope, and you should have hope, that the work that's being done here will be beneficial both to our generation and the next.
It gives the policymaker an opportunity to have additional information available to them that then in turn they can use to shape policy so that we don't reach those tipping points.
And no other time, I think, in Earth's humanity has that connection between the public and private sector and educational sector has been so important. Because the changes that are going to have to be made are going to be driven by policy and scaled up by business.
The question really is, how long will those solutions last? And can they be passed down to other generations? And we don't know the answers to those questions. And we don't know how these solutions will survive under future ocean conditions. And that's where the Biosphere 2 comes in, because we can actually simulate what oceans will experience, not just today, but 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future.
What I see right now that's important for us to be doing is to take that information, and B2 gives you a chance to do it. What does the basic science say? And how does it really translate to the real world? B2 is a step in that translational process. So I see B2 as a nice tool in the translational science.
We know the issues that we need to solve. We also know the issues are solvable.
The Biosphere, it's like an icon of possibilities.
Where do we go from here? Well, the scientists will continue to experiment. They will continue to understand Earth systems. And at the end of the day, those experiments will inform the way that our governments, that our people, that we as citizens of Earth must steward Biosphere 1.
Face accessing the whole climate finance that is available is another challenge. This is because eligibility is currently based on GDP per capita, and we have been speaking loudly right here this week about the use of GDP and the pressures that puts and the disadvantage that puts on many of the most vulnerable states. And we have been asking for the past 20 years, 30 years about some form of a criteria, and we have been speaking most loudly in this conference and working with our friends from the UK in the past years and others about the vulnerability index. Our message today is clear. We need scale-up support for adaptation, for that which is commensurate with our developing needs. We also need support allocated specifically for averting and minimizing, addressing loss and damage, an area for us that is vital. Finally, colleagues, we need to improve access to finance that is available. We need such access to be simplified by ensuring that international financial institutions do not operate in a manner that restricts this critical support to those who need it most, the most vulnerable. We hope that these important dialogues here this morning and throughout this week at COP26 will be complemented by ambitious outcomes and action. This is an action COP, and we must not leave, as I have been saying, inching our way forward. If we can't make a quantum leap, we certainly could make a significant stride. And we, in the small islands, need you. Your failure to work with us would have been a failure for mankind. We thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Webson, for a very powerful message. Could I now turn to Minister Hassan and just ask him that Seychelles, of course, is not a stranger to severe weather events, as we know. Can you tell us a little bit more about the partnerships, the innovation that you have used to try and bring about resilience from climate change?
Thank you, Minister Sharma, and good afternoon to everybody in the room. So, after the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2008, the Seychelles faced a huge debt crisis, with public debt rising to over 150% of GDP. And this led to an IMF-led reform program, and we had to partner with the Paris Club to restructure the debt. And subsequently to that, in 2011, we received support from the Nature Conservancy and other organizations to restructure the debt on more favorable terms, culminating in an agreement to swap $30 million of existing Paris Club debt for a fund to conserve Seychelles ocean species against overfishing and climate change, and that was in 2015. In that same year, Seychelles established the independent Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, known as SECAD, which was to manage the proceeds of the debt restructuring. So part of these funds have been used to, one, develop and implement climate risk reduction and social resilience plans, and second, install stream gauges in selected rivers. And on the latter, training is being provided to collect data and compile and analyze these to support the management of climate risk. However, I cannot emphasize the need for us to explore more of these innovative options and partnership if we are to achieve the objective that we have set ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for setting out some of the innovative approaches that you've been taking. Perhaps I could now turn to State Secretary Flachspart. And State Secretary, we've just heard some of the concerns from the climate vulnerable countries. And I know that the German government works very closely with many of these countries. Can you explain what are the donors actually doing to provide and respond to support where it's needed? And I think it is the pace of the responses you've also heard, which is vitally important.
Thank you very much, Honourable Alok Sharma, for this question, and thank you to our colleagues for their valuable insights. As we have heard, the needs for adaptation, especially in the needs for the SIDS, are really high and keep increasing as climate impacts worsen. So the groundbreaking OECD report on losses and damages presented on Monday made this painful clear once again. As co-chair of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, a position that I share with Minister Wazee from the Republic of Marshall Islands, I have also learned a lot about these specific vulnerabilities. Fortunately, while the needs are growing, awareness and support are increasing too. Let me give you some examples. Resilience members are supporting regional risk pools, namely the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. Germany sees regional risk pools like these as one of the key tools in increasing resilience and as a very good way of encouraging a proactive approach to disaster risk management and financing. Therefore, I'm especially pleased to use the opportunity of our discussion today to announce an additional 10 million euros this year to each of these two funds in the Caribbean and Pacific regions. At the same time, reacting better to disasters is, of course, only one side of the coin. We also need to reduce exposure and vulnerability in advance through adaptation action. So the need for adaptation measures is increasing worldwide, and with the need for considerably more financial means. We know that adaptation finance still falls short of what is necessary. Therefore, we must collectively step up our efforts and raise our ambitions still further. Germany has further increased its climate finance goal from 4 to 6 billion euros from budget sources by 2025 at the latest. We very much desire to see an increase in the total sphere of climate finance spent on adaptation and resilience, and I would like to invite other countries here today to join us in these efforts. Furthermore, besides the need for rising availability of finance for adaptation, access to it is also a major challenge. So studies suggest that only a fraction of climate finance is spent locally. Even if the funds are available, they must also be accessible and get to where they are needed the most. We have to address these challenges more strongly by facilitating access to climate finance and by helping to improve the capacities of our partners to manage these funds. Finally, I would still like to stress that Germany will continue to stand with the SIDS as a reliable partner in tackling climate change. So thank you very much.
State Secretary, thank you very much for that and for the additional announcements on funding. I also want to formally thank our friends in the German government for the work we did together on the $100 billion delivery plan. I think that was a very good cooperation. I'd now like to turn to one of our friends from the MDBs, from the Multilateral Development Banks, Dr. Bonilla, who's here representing the IADB. And really just to ask you, Dr. Bonilla, to set out what is it that you think MDBs need to do more of? I mean, clearly there is the move towards Paris alignment in terms of your funds flow. There is a commitment from many of the MDBs to spend more on climate. But is there more that you can be doing? And maybe to put you a little bit on the spot, do you see a trajectory in terms of where the finance will move from MDBs when it comes to climate?
First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to be here with you and congratulate you for your leadership at this COP. I think the question about the MDBs, I will try to explain the importance of adaptation and climate risk, saying that I think the priority is to integrate management of climate risk and disasters with all the agenda of adaptation and resiliency. As you said, 24% of our climate change finance has been going to adaptation, but at the end your question is very relevant, is how we can innovate from our financing mechanisms, our lending and other instruments to integrate climate disaster with the role of biodiversity and nature as part of the resiliency that we need to build at the national level, at the subnational level, and as part of the private sector development. As our president mentioned yesterday, the Vision 2025 of the IDB includes that the recovery of Latin America and the Caribbean post-pandemic needs to have climate and sustainability as part of that recovery, and resiliency and adaptation as a key component. As you have heard from our head of states these days, we see the impacts of climate daily. And it's moving too fast that I think it's a call for us, not only for the MDBs, but for all the financing world, to be more flexible and agile to this response. So, President, I will mention 3 topics in terms of how to do this. The first one, we started working a lot in our region to do an assessment of institutional and financial capacities of the governments related to natural disaster. So we have developed an index, it's called the IGOP. It's an index of governance and public policy capacity of the countries to address climate disasters. As part of that exercise, we found out that we needed to develop an instrument directly for the ministers of finance of the region to disaster response, an ex-ante instrument. So we created the contingency credit line facility at the IDB to guarantee access to this facility and for the ministers of finance to have a credit line, an ex-ante credit line that we send to them after the disaster. So it's an ex-ante credit line of credit that they don't have to pay any interest or any fee until they use it. But this facility guarantees the access to do that. We have, President, already 14 countries of the region using that facility, and we have approved $1.9 billion as part of that. What we have done during the pandemic, we said we have to innovate this credit facility and we expand the use of that facility also for pandemics in the future, seeing the link that we have of pandemics with biodiversity and nature. But we found out, President, that we need to go beyond. I mean, you have heard these days the impacts on the Caribbean and on Central America. So we said, for those countries that have already access to the contingent credit facility, we need to create what we're calling the hurricane clause. It's a clause that the IDB is including in our lending to defer the payments of principal payments for 2 years in IDB-eligible operations. I think that is something that is going to create fiscal space for climate events and disaster response. We have so far started conversations with Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, and Dominican Republic to include this clause in our lending. But we needed to do the same from the private sector. I think a key role from the MDBs is through our private sector, start helping companies and private sector also to respond to climate impacts. So IDB Invest, which is the arm, the private sector arm of the IDB group, developed back in 2017 what we call the El Niño clause. Seeing the impact of the El Niño in fisheries in Peru, they created this clause to reschedule loan capital payments for private sector companies during the month of the impact of the climate on the company, to have the opportunity to recover. Seeing what they have done with that, they have used it already for 3 operations. The last one was approved in August. They have expanded El Niño clause, and now they are including the financial resiliency clause, not only for El Niño, but for La Niña, flooding, droughts, and fires, just to help private sector companies and private financial institutions to recover. Having said this, President, and with this I will conclude, we need to also at the same time build on resiliency. How we can build on constructing and building resiliency from the national, subnational level and private sector. So as part of that, the IDB is including in our portfolio nature-based solutions. 28 operations that we've done in the last years for infrastructure are including nature-based solutions for more than $800 million. We have developed the Natural Capital Lab at the bank with the support of your government, UK and France, to start piloting blue carbon solutions with, for example, mangroves in the Caribbean and coastal cities. But we have to, at the national level, good examples like the roof to reef in Barbados, like the decarbonization plan that we have supporting Costa Rica, start bringing these concepts in the beginning. At the subnational level, we're developing the first loan precedent for Barranquilla as part of the Biodiversity program of President Duque to finance mangroves, urban wetlands, and different options of resiliency to climate to integrate biodiversity, nature-based solutions into resiliency to climate change. In Chile, we approved a national program for informal neighborhoods, and a key component of that is doing a map of assessment to natural disaster risk and the response, including nature-based solutions. IDV Invest just announced and put in the market the first blue bond in Latin America to support private sector in Latin America related to ocean and the contamination of water. So we have to invest through our lending, but also helping our governments to issue bonds as part of the response. And key, and I'm very happy to see here also the President of the African Development Bank, continuous access to concessional resources to do the blended in our instruments. We have proof, as MDBs, the importance of blended financing for decarbonization. Now we need to do the same for adaptation and resiliency. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Juan. Since you started talking about the private sector, I think it's good now we turn to John Hanley, who is the CEO of Willis Towers Watson. John, there's obviously been a lot of focus in recent years from the private sector investing in climate, investing in climate resilience. And what would be great is to hear about some of the new partnerships or innovative instruments that that are out there, and basically what are the challenges around these? Over to you.
So thank you, Mr. President, and it's an honor to join this panel on behalf of the private sector and to update you on some key initiatives. And I think it's particularly fitting to be speaking here in Glasgow, as this city and Scotland more broadly provide great inspiration and influence for some of the work we're doing. It was here in Scotland in 1776 that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations and laid the intellectual foundations of the industrial revolutions that followed. And that's from the shipbuilding cranes we see here on the River Clyde to the wider transformation around the world. And at COP26 in Glasgow here, we're confronting both the environmental costs and the economic benefits of what was unleashed 245 years ago. Adam Smith described the invisible hand of economics that shapes our lives and our world. It helped explain what gets built, who prospers, and who does not. Now, in this climate emergency, that invisible hand needs to be redirected. Since Paris, we've been working to guide the financial system's invisible hand to shape a resilient future. An economy that protects our investments from climate will also protect the homes of our citizens, their crops, and their livelihood. So, getting back to the question you posed, we're a long way from saying mission accomplished, but the progress and the momentum to date has me very confident in our ability to turn planning and theory into some real impact. So to provide some examples today, I'd like to highlight 4 flagship initiatives, and they're all based on collaborative and innovative foundations. And while they've made extraordinary progress, I think they also lend themselves to the question of what's next. So the first initiative flows directly from Paris. The Insurance Development Forum, or the IDF, was launched at COP21. And it was co-chaired by the insurance industry, by the UNDP, and by the World Bank. And under the leadership of IDF Chair Denis Duvernay of AXA, and Ikoswani Iyahan, its Secretary General, as well as the support of the German government, the IDF is supporting disaster risk finance across 20 developing countries as part of the Ensure Resilience target to protect 500 million people from climate risks by 2025. Secretary Floxbarth, let me just say thank you so much for your help in driving so much of this work. The latest development out of the IDF that's focused on the most vulnerable countries is a formal partnership that's actually being announced today. So the IDF is going to be supporting the V20 group of climate vulnerable countries to inform resilience through the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. The second initiative is a bit of a wider one, and it advances climate risk on behalf climate risk modeling, on behalf of all countries. So last year, in discussions with the IDF, Mark Carney gave us a challenge. There's an information failure that exists. We don't have the data and the analytics to properly understand climate risk. And that's part of what's driving the climate resilience emergency. I'm pleased to share an important global breakthrough that is also being announced this week. The Global Resilience Index Initiative, supported by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and others, is going to provide climate resilience data analytics for all by COP27. The third initiative I'd like to highlight relates to investment in infrastructure. And that initiative is the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, or CCRI. Now, I have the good fortune to chair this coalition. We launched it at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019. We come to COP26 with 120 members, over 120 trillion of assets under advisement, and we represent governments, we represent the financial sector, engineers, and many other organizations. And CCRI has kept its promise from 2019 that we would deliver practical solutions for a better pricing of physical climate risks in investment decision-making. And we cover two key areas of decision-making: national planning, or systemic resilience, and asset design and structuring. All CCRI solutions recognize the challenge faced by the small island developing states when it comes to physical climate risks. So we've had a wonderful partnership with the government of Jamaica and with the support of the UK government and the Green Climate Fund. And next week, we're going to be launching a tool that allows for the identification of the projects most capable of protecting the economic, social, and ecosystem value in Jamaica over the next 20 years. We're very excited about the impact of this tool, and we plan to roll it out in many other countries in the years to come. The final initiative is governance. To mainstream progress, regulation of financial markets requires climate risk to be disclosed, accounted, and managed. Here at COP, insurance and wider financial regulators have contributed to a call to action. This call to action was launched this morning by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, among others, and it includes 20 actions to apply climate resilience mandates across the financial system. So in closing, I propose an answer to the question of what's next, that here in Glasgow, with the inspiration of its economic heritage, we declare a new financial order, one that builds upon the economic influence of this place and forges a new role for the invisible hand to guide a resilient and prosperous future. Thank you.
John, thank you very much, and indeed thank you to all our panelists for their very insightful comments and remarks. And I think we've heard about the challenges, we've heard about some of the solutions, and I think what is very clear now is that we push forward and ensure that we do more, particularly in terms of supporting vulnerable countries and developing countries collectively. We're going to continue this conversation. Obviously, there will be a discussion next panel, but also on Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day next week, which will be a theme day at COP. We will continue this really important discussion. But for the moment, thank you all for coming, and let me pass you back to Gillian.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Minister Sharma. And I'd like to ask this panel to leave the podium, return to their seats, and invite up the members of the next panel who are going to be talking about these very important themes. And it's worth stressing, We've heard so many billions and trillions tossed around this morning. We've heard a lot of ambitious pledges from the financial and business community that it's often very easy to forget that there are actually real people suffering at the end of these conversations. We need to keep in mind these issues about equity and inclusion and justice, as well as the talk about all the money. If we forget that, then we'll be letting down all the people who are currently suffering around the world from the impacts of climate change. Anyway, we have a great panel to talk to us now about some of these key themes. The moderator is going to be Dr. Adesina from Nigeria, who is the president of the African Development Bank Group that has an incredibly important role to play. We also have Rachel Turner, who's the director of the International Finance FCDO. We have as well, excuse me with my pages, because we have a number of people, which is terrific. Aya Saeed Kayum, who's the Minister of Economy from Fiji. And last but not, we have those three as the panelists, and then we have Dr. Adesina, who's going to be moderating the panel. So I'm going to ask them all to come up to the stage, and as they do, we have a video to remind us both of what is happening on the ground, but also to give us some insights and maybe a reason for optimism in terms of what young people are doing. So can the panelists and the moderator come up to stage? Thank you.
I'm from Borneo, and we have the oldest tropical rainforest in the world. I grew up watching the endless destructions of the rainforest itself. And my people, my family, friends that I grew up with, are affected by this. I want to help, and I want to be part of the solutions, not the problem. My name is Mona Lisa, and I'm from Indonesia. I'm now working at Ventures Worldwide as a communications coordinator. And we are focusing on landscape restorations project both in Uganda and Indonesia. The biggest issues are the regulations that are not protecting the environment and the indigenous people, and the fact that we don't have the knowledge to protect ourselves as well as our forest. I hope to see more young people taking actions and be aware of what is going on, and I really hope that they will get all the supports they need.
My name is Betty Osei-Bosu. I'm the project coordinator for Green Africa Youth Organization and the co-founder of the Trees for Biodiversity initiative, which is supporting communities towards climate resilience. I was brought up in an area where I could feel the burns of climate change. No shades, no trees. Currently in Ghana, statistics show that we've lost 80% of our forest covers. We need support in terms of funds and digital innovation when it comes to tree planting exercises. I am expecting a very inclusive climate policy document and a constructive policy for tree plantings and funds to be able to upscale tree planting initiatives.
I'm Joyce Mendes, co-founder of several grassroots organizations and initiatives in Latin America, especially in the border of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, a place known as Artejas de Aguas. We are in the front lines of the climate emergency. Of course, one of the main challenges is funding, but is funding towards vulnerable communities like indigenous communities or also communities that are not in the main cities. We need representation of vulnerable communities, of indigenous communities in the decision taking place.
My name is Desmond Aluna. I'm the co-founder and programs manager for Green Africa Youth Organization and also on the Youth Advisory Panel for the Global Center on Adaptation. My motivation stems from where I come from, the rural part of northern Ghana, where desertification and drought has been a very significant impact on smallholder farmers. Funding finance is a key support for us to tackle climate change adaptation at the community level. The other thing is training and capacity building for organizations that are working in these areas in order for them to tackle it and tackle it properly.
Our work and what we are doing depends heavily in the following days, the decisions that you will be taking.
We need capacity building for the people who are working on the ground level, and we need funding support to scale up our projects.
It is time we all take action. Stakeholders have to come together.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the climate, as we've just seen, is changing. Life is becoming more vulnerable and unbearable for millions around the world. The world has no choice but to adapt. There isn't enough resources right now for developing countries to cope with the deluge of negative effects of climate change, especially small island states that are even more vulnerable, as we were told in the last panel. The world will need $1 to $2 trillion a year for the next 30 years to tackle climate change. Africa itself would need $335 billion by 2030 to implement climate adaptation actions. Of these, 20% will be from country resources and 80% from development partners. And that's why the developed world must meet its commitment to provide $100 billion per year for climate financing. We must build confidence in the global community that our words are our bond. As the late United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan once told me, and I quote him, "The only promises that matter are the promises kept." The African Development Bank is keeping its promises. We've doubled our climate finance to $25 billion by 2025. And we exceeded 50% target for adaptation and reached 63% for climate adaptation in 2020. To do even more, we have launched together with the Global Center for Adaptation, the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, to mobilize $25 billion for adaptation. The role of the private sector will become very critical, and the need to have both market and non-market-based mechanisms to provide incentives for the private sector. It is time to also shift the narrative around climate adaptation from a public good financed by simply public funds to opportunities, and they have asked, for the private sector. The countries represented here on this panel today, Kenya, Fiji, are examples of countries taking bold and innovative measures to tackle climate change. We will hear their voices. We will understand their challenges. The UK, which is also on this panel, will help to share perspectives on how best to support developing countries as they tackle climate adaptation. So let's get started. Let me call on you, Kenya Cabinet Secretary Yatani. Throughout your career, you've seen the importance of adaptation action. What are your priorities to finance this action? You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me this opportunity to be also on this panel and to interact and give Kenyan positions on this. The growing frequency and severity of climate-induced disasters, such as drought, floods, and cyclones, as well as the longer-term trends in temperature and rainfall variability, are depressing public revenues and putting more expenditure demands on budget. We have seen to the extent that, on average, we lose close to 3% of GDP in most parts of Africa, with some countries even focusing more. Now, back to your questions. The importance of adaptation financing, what are our key priorities? In our updated national determined contributions, adaptations remains our key priority, not only through preventing further losses and damage, but underpinning infrastructure and economic development while safeguarding lives, livelihoods, and also achieving more social development. The adaptation priorities also are highlighted in our National Adaptation Plan, as well as the National Climate Change Action Plan. We are committed to enhancing adaptation by further committing to bridge the implementation gaps through mainstreaming and upscaling adaptation across all sectors, as well as enhancing grassroots resilience by supporting financing of locally led climate change actions. We aim to attain a triple adaptation dividend by avoiding losses, enhancing economic benefits, as well as social and environmental benefits through priority actions. In the areas of early warning systems, investing in early warning systems, climate-proofing infrastructure, reducing floods and drought risk, protecting natural assets such as forests, mangroves, seagrass, and coral ecosystems, but also investing more in water harvesting and conservation by further also restoring degraded land and sea escapes, by also supporting a nature-based solution. The findings of the Kenyan Landscape of Climate Change Finance Report of 2021 shows that finance flows to adaptation action is low as compared to mitigation. And that is the area that we need to embark more by making sure that there is a nexus between adaptation and also mitigation. The government of Kenya is making deliberate actions to mainstream prioritizing and mobilizing climate finances towards adaptation actions. The Financing Locally Led Climate Action Program is an example of such, where both at the national and the subnational level, there's nexus and the adequate planning to manage and mitigate against these challenges. We are currently reviewing as well as developing fiscal policies that prioritize adaptation financing. We're in the process of developing a national policy framework on green fiscal incentive. In the scheduled issuance of sovereign green bond in the region, in the not distant future, we have identified priority adaptations projects and programs that are eligible for financing through the green bond proceeds. Additionally, also at the local level, we've worked so hard as a government by putting budgets in areas of adaptation, where we look at financing from our own exchequer. We also have components on loans, grants, but also as well as the Green Climate Fund. We also able to draw into the KDDO of World Bank to ensure that these areas of adaptations are given the necessary prominence as deserved. Currently, we are experiencing a severe drought in the region, and to mitigate against this, we've dealt on a number of areas by carrying out massive livestock offtake, by also providing water. We are also providing our support under the hunger safety net by identifying the critical communities who are in need of food and other support along the way. We are also investing more also in irrigation. We are also carrying out insurance for livestock to support the communities get payback as a result of loss of this livestock. We've also now carried out additional adequate information flows across all communities by advising them on what they do, what they need to do, how they do it, and what kind of support they're going to get. We've looked at a number of structuring of projects under the adaptations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for those actions and bold initiatives by Kenya. Let me now turn to the UK, Richard Turner. What needs to happen to get finance flowing behind these adaptation actions like we just heard from the Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you very much, Adeshina. I think there are three things that I want to really set our sights on, our ambition on, three things that I think need to feature in the future partnerships between developed and developing countries to support adaptation. And the first is on risk and risk transfer. And I want to echo the importance that was really covered by the last panel, but I think is so important, the importance of the growing maturity of the risk financing system. I think the fact that developed countries are now putting capital into the risk pools and holding developing country risk. I think the fact that developed countries have now agreed new principles for subsidizing risk premiums for the most vulnerable countries are so important shifts in the overall architecture for supporting adaptation. I also think the extraordinary movement forward in shock-responsive social protection systems like Kenya's, which I think many of us know about and are monitoring very carefully with great excitement. I think the bringing together of those social protection systems with the risk architecture really is starting to deliver huge strides in systems that will underpin adaptation delivery and make sure that finance reaches the most vulnerable. Second is volume, and next steps on mobilizing volume for adaptation finance has to be part and parcel of our partnership. And you heard Alok Sharma earlier, he was frank about the shortfalls in public finance for adaptation and the calls for donors to do more. But we also feel that there are huge opportunities to work together to mobilize the wall of private sector green finance, as our Chancellor described it earlier, to mobilize that wall of finance behind countries' adaptation plans. And I think particularly there, we feel that there are opportunities to shift the ecosystem around green sovereign bonds. I do feel quite strongly that developed countries must and will do more to help build that sovereign green bond ecosystem that His Excellency Minister Katani was talking about, to work with countries to help meet the sovereign standards for green bonds, but in a way that helps the finance flow efficiently behind the kind of green budgets that Minister Katani was talking about, making it easier and smoother, if you like, to support and get right behind countries' adaptation financing plans. And finally, and third, on access, I think Minister Kaum is going to say more about access, but the challenges countries face on access to climate finance, the heavy transaction costs, the palaver of accessing projects, that really needs to change. And sovereign green bond issuances, I think, are one part of that. But really there's a need for more wholesale reform to move from project to programmatic support behind countries' adaptation plans. And I do think developed countries are committed to reform. The Task Force on Access to Climate Finance that was established in March, jointly chaired by the UK and Fiji, is determined to drive those reforms. And you heard as well from our Chancellor this morning that the UK has made an announcement of 100 million of fast, efficient, aligned financing behind adaptation plans. So I think those three things, I think risk sharing, volume, harnessing the private sector behind adaptation plans through a new sovereign bond ecosystem, and reforms to access, I think that's really where we need to concentrate our efforts going forward. And innovation is happening, but there's a lot more to do, and there are responsibilities on us as developed country partners to help make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks very much for your great support for many of these efforts. Let me now turn to you, Minister Syed Kayyum. Fiji has been a leader in innovative climate financing among small island developing states. How do you see adaptation finance evolving to meet the needs of climate vulnerable countries like yours?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, evolving is certainly the right word when it comes to climate financing, because it needs to evolve significantly. As we have said before, our development finance architecture cannot stand the heat of our warming world. Gaps in equity between developed and developing nations are becoming chasms. As climate finance remains rudimentary and/or parochial in relation to the worsening climate-driven challenges we are expected to manage. Our issue is rooted in more than climate finance. Our whole global financial system is modeled on a world and economic reality that in fact has ceased to exist. It is built for the different problems of a different century. This is in the 1940s. Decolonization has taken place and changed the dynamics of global interaction. Our global community is larger, our economies are more interconnected, and threats are more diverse than they were in the post-war era. Information technology has radically changed our lives. The paradigm was affected by the aftershocks of the GFC and disrupted again by COVID-19, which we are currently experiencing. Meanwhile, runaway climate change catastrophe risks creating an entirely new age of catastrophe is taking place, including, of course, debt and debt sustainability as seen through conventional lenses. The lines are blurring between the once clearer demarcations in between public and private financing responsibilities, between our individual and shared responsibilities, between our sovereign requirements and the available resources. The $100 billion a year target for climate finance, which is pledged and due by 2020, is an unfinished pillar of the Paris Agreement's architecture. This achievable goal has been eroded by indecision, inaction, and most worryingly of all, a misunderstanding of both fundamental economics and science. We are told it is likely to arrive by 2023. I guess we are supposed to say better late than never, but of course we'll have to go with that. But that logic does not hold. It's the same logic that got us here in the first place. When you live in the front line of climate change, delays can be devastating. In Fiji, we are really expected to suck it up and wait it out. When we received London's annual rainfall in the space of 24 hours, just about 6 months ago, or when 1/3 of our GDP is wiped out in 36 hours by the force of a climate change mutated cyclone event. Our concern with climate finance is that it lacks formalization and structure. And what little structure we have requested, we have not received. We don't know what will be available in 2 years. We don't know if it will be in the form of grants or as loans with punishing interest rates. We do not know how much will be allocated for adaptation and how much for mitigation. We don't know what we will access successfully through the different funds. We don't know if climate finance will be treated as debt, or will there be an opportunity to have debt for nature swaps. And we don't know who will or who won't pledge support bilaterally year to year. Climate finance in 2021 is as volatile as the strengthening storms that rip through the fabric of our economy year in, year out. In Fiji, we now know more than ever that we need to bring forward relevant proposals and initiatives to define what form of future accessible and affordable finance can take place. Through parametric insurance, private sector engagement, innovative de-risking initiatives for critical infrastructure, and a pragmatic approach to capital markets. We are doing all we can to define and cultivate the shape of the next generation of climate finance. Just green bonds, if I could salute, Chair. We recently launched green bonds about 3 years ago in the London Stock Exchange. Fantastic optics, interest rates were terrible. We paid in excess of 6%. The front line of climate, of course, is the cutting edge of climate finance innovation. Fiji is attempting to pioneer solutions through our DRAW incubator, because if we don't, highly exposed communities in Fiji, in the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and other places in the world, the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, even countries like Bangladesh, will be forced to cope with both inadequate finance and mounting climate risks. If I could put it straight, the IMF says the fossil fuel industry benefits from subsidies of about $11 million every minute. How many minutes have there been since we landed the Paris Agreement? How many millions have gone towards this war on the climate? And how many years till we wake up and recognize we built a system that actually destroys the planet by design itself? It should not take years. We can fix the system now if we recognize its flaws. On the one hand, there's about a rapid scale-up in the amount of finance deployed from 2025 onwards, and Fiji is calling for a floor of US $750 billion per annum from 2025 onwards. To get there, we will require increased engagement of the private sector in both the financing and delivery of climate change solutions. In the immediate term, we need the $100 billion per annum at a minimum. We should achieve that before 2023. What the funding is purposed for is key. The adaptation financing gap has dangerous implications. We need to ensure the 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation purpose financing, and we welcome the efforts of those countries that have stepped up the adaptation finance at COP26. And we call on the high emitters, of course, at this COP to address the adaptation finance gap, specifically by at least doubling their contribution to adaptation finance. Chair, I'll be just one more minute. There is a relationship between the different financing targets and priorities we discuss and negotiate under the UNFCCC. Failure to invest in solutions to reduce carbon emissions drives climate change risks, which in turn increases adaptation financing needs. A lack of investment or late investment in mitigation and adaptation priorities leads to loss and damage. All three of these financing priorities are interrelated. Our financing regime needs to be rethought and rewoven into a system that delivers scalable, accessible, and timely outcomes. In Fiji, we recently passed legislation to change the way we use and purpose our public-private financial resources. Fiji's Climate Change Act requires all government ministries, for example, to submit detail on the way in which their budget submissions have considered and actively helped deliver against Fiji's climate objectives. The Act also requires companies and financial institutions to disclose information on their annual reports on the way in which climate risks have been taken into account. It also provides the legal framework for engaging with the emerging carbon markets. If we are going to adapt to climate change, we need to ensure adaptation is not an afterthought or a project or a checkbox exercise. It must become the foundation of our new economic system, and it must be funded now before the costs become insurmountable. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister Kaye. Let me try and wrap up our two sessions. We had a great panel just before ours, and thank you very much to the Cabinet Secretary and Minister. I wish to thank our distinguished panelists for their excellent contributions and for very enriching discussions. So what did we hear? We heard that disasters are increasing, from cyclones to floods and droughts. We heard that we must scale up market risk transfer mechanisms to support countries and individuals. From catastrophic bonds to disaster risk sharing facilities, or as we just heard from the Minister from Fiji, parametric index-based crop and livestock insurance, the same one be done also in Kenya. We have heard that this will play a big role in helping to protect our world and its people. We've heard also the importance of social protection systems and locally led climate adaptation plans, as in Kenya. We heard that preparedness is very critical. So we will need to invest more in climate information systems and hydrometeorological data collection to provide information for insurance products. Programs such as the Africa Disaster Risk Facility, which is supported by the African Development Bank, that helps to insure countries against catastrophic risk events, need to be scaled up to help countries to co-pay premiums. And here I want to thank UK government for its great support for that. And also the point that was raised about the need to have regional risk pooling mechanisms by Minister Flashback. The multilateral development banks can offer huge resources for countries to adapt to climate change. In the case of Africa, the African Adaptation Acceleration Program needs to be strongly supported with additional $12.5 billion so that it gets the resources to deploy for climate adaptation for Africa at scale, just to meet the kind of challenges that we just had from Cabinet Secretary Yatani. We heard that countries are embarking on successful and innovative homegrown climate change adaptation policies and programs, but they will need greater levels of resources to support their efforts. Collectively, we all have to work harder to ensure that we all do all we can to align with national programs and priorities of countries. And for that, we need financing for countries to develop and update their nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies. We must also leverage significant pools of financing in the private sector, especially for climate adaptation, with market and non-market-based incentive systems. To finance a more resilient world, we must deploy innovative financing tools. Together, public and private sectors, with the support of philanthropies, can make a huge difference. Donor countries need to also deploy innovative approaches to further increase financing for adaptation and resilience. And here I'd like to again thank the UK government for providing the African Development Bank with $2 billion of guarantee that will enable us to significantly scale our financing for climate investments in Africa. And finally, the big $100 billion per year promise. This absolutely needs to be kept, the commitment has to be met. The $100 billion per year promise of developed countries are simply like lifeboats for developing countries, so they do not drown in the face of existential threats of climate change. Promises made must become promises kept. As we look to COP27 in Africa, let's make sure that promises made right here in Glasgow are fully kept before Africa's COP. Thank you all very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I said this morning that what marks out today, what marks out COP26 and makes it different from before, is the fact that the money men and the money women are in force in town. But that is only a good thing if we remember 2 points that have emerged very clearly from the panels. Firstly, that climate finance needs to be effective. And we've heard just now in a very passionate speech from Syed Qayyum, and that speech, frankly, I think should be printed out and put on the desk of every developed country finance minister right now. We've heard that climate finance until now has not been very effective. And the question going forward is, how do we make that more effective? But secondly, we cannot forget about the issue of equity, the second E, and the question of how finance is actually used to help developing world as well as the developed world. So this concludes the panel, third panel of today. The fourth panel is going to pick up these themes and develop it further. It's called Developing Finance for Emerging Markets and Developing Economies, and I look forward to hearing more debate and more answers in that discussion later on. So please come back at 2:15 for the next panel. Thank you.
We realize that climate change is a big issue. And so we are trying to figure out what are the actions that we need, what to do, and how to prepare to respond to climate change.
We know that extremes are changing. We know that many extreme frequencies and magnitudes are most likely to go up, and therefore we need better forecasts to prepare for them.
We need water for the environment, to drink, to live, but also water is very dangerous. So understanding the fluctuations of rivers and how much water will be and whether sometimes it's dangerous or not, it's critical for the well-being of the society.
Every year we see that things like droughts and floods affect huge numbers of populations and economies around the world, and all of these have spillover effects in different ways. And one of the things that we can really do working together is being able to provide a more global framework for these kinds of systems.
One of the first steps is actually to have the information, the necessary information to make decisions, to make informed decisions.
We need to get better in reacting to extremes. We need to learn earlier what happens. The earlier we know what happens, the easier we can do something about it.
The GeoGlobe's partnership is organized under GEO, the Group on Earth Observation, and specifically focuses on global water sustainability and bringing together some of the world leaders in NASA, NOAA, ECMWF, ESRI, and the World Bank in order to develop tools that can provide a forecast on every river of the world to be able to be downloaded and accessed locally.
Look at any stream segment anywhere in the world to try and get both a feel for what the flows could be in the next 2 weeks, as well as what the flows could have been in the last 40 years.
That gives insight into hydrology where none existed before, while also providing a 15-day ensemble forecast on every river in the world.
And use those both for operational planning in terms of what to do about water infrastructure in the next 2 weeks, as well as planning from the historical point of view if you wanted to see what the return flows could be or how those are changing over time, or to try and see how to better design a lot of the systems that are out there.
GeoGlobe centralizes infrastructure and also resources in such a way that everybody has access to the same information.
The philosophy behind GeoGlobe and the global stream flow forecast service is really that that's done centrally by organizations that can afford it, or funded by the World Bank. So then local communities don't have to invest in that, and they can invest in really answering questions which matter to them.
So working together to solve the most difficult problems, such as flood forecasting or hydrological forecasting, requires collaboration across the globe from loads of different types of entities, from a European or from a global level, but also to a small-scale regional level. And that's where GeoGlobe comes in. It glues all those different agencies together. It makes sure that the information flows between them. It makes sure that they're connected to each other and talk to each other.
It does best with bias correction, and the bias correction needs a lot of in situ data to try and better calibrate, in a way, the information that's there, so that you can get better results from it.
GeoGlobe is analysis-ready data that is providing not only the information and knowledge, but is allowing the local governments and national governments, regardless of the country, to make the decisions in time.
With the Ganges, if you look at what happened kind of in the past 100 years, they will have what we call a regime, a variation in the river discharge, which will be very different from those three rivers. But the day-to-day change, it really influenced by what happened very recently in terms of rainfall. So it's really important to simulate that daily variation and not just to rely on what we call the climatological information. And this is what our models are able to do. And when then you plug in weather forecasts, then you can anticipate episodes, for example, flooding episodes. If weather forecasts predict very intense rainfall in the next 5 days, then we can translate that in whether it's likely to generate flooding or not.
Electrical company in Honduras that during Hurricane Eta and Iota were able to make decisions in between the storms to release in such a way that they could have the space, the necessary space for the water that the second storm was dumping, and in such a way save the people of the Valle del Sula.
It makes a difference to people. We know that, for example, floods are devastating. We know that water scarcity is really a big problem. And if me and my team, the European Centre, we can do a little bit to provide more information, so then people can get prepared, nations can make decisions. It's amazing, and we do that better and better. We're not just doing work to produce a report. We produce data that is then used, and that's fantastic to be part of.
I think the future for me is that GeoGlobe has to or will go to a next level, which for me includes a model not just of a single component such as hydrology or water impact. That really for me is sort of representing the Earth, representing a model of the Earth. So rather than just having a weather forecast and a land surface model, feeding into a hydrological model, then doing maybe some impact modeling, it's all of these components together. It's one thing together. It's really the integrating of those models, the regional and the global knowledge, into one single entity.
So GeoGlobe actually is allowing for that environment to for all these powerful organizations to come together and respond to a societal need, which is the need for actionable information in such a way that the observations can be incorporated into the decision-making process.
Increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide from the use of fossil fuels is leading to rising temperatures, loss of habitat, and loss of economic productivity. The Paris Agreement is an important commitment by 195 countries to substantially decrease CO2 emissions. But how are we going to do that when we are so dependent on fossil fuels in energy production, in industry, and in transport? Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, has the potential to achieve deep cuts in industrial CO2 emissions.
The Peter Cook Center is a vibrant community of students and researchers working on two overarching objectives: to reduce the costs of the CO2 capture process and to develop knowledge and technologies to ensure safe CO2 storage in the deep subsurface.
The Latrobe Valley, east of Melbourne in the state of Victoria, is well known for its brown coal, which has been mined for over 100 years for power generation. Recognising the need to transition to a low-carbon economy, the state government of Victoria decided to phase out coal mining for power generation and is currently exploring other uses for brown coal. In particular, hydrogen production. The Hydrogen Energy Supply Chain, also known as the HESC project, currently operates a hydrogen production pilot plant funded by a consortium of Japanese companies, the Australian government, and the state government of Victoria in the Latrobe Valley. The hydrogen produced in the Latrobe Valley will be transported to Port Hastings, where it will be liquefied and transported in dedicated ships to customers in Japan. The hydrogen used will not emit any carbon dioxide, so it serves as a clean fuel. The current pilot project details the technical feasibility of producing clean hydrogen in the Latrobe Valley, the export of hydrogen to customers overseas, and the permanent storage of CO2 in the deep subsurface. Hydrogen production from coal produces CO2, which will be injected and permanently stored in a carbonated CO2 storage site offshore. The CO2 storage in geological structures below the sea floor at Bass Strait have been investigated for over 15 years, and the storage conditions and capacity are considered to be excellent. This geological assessment of the CO2 storage site has been conducted by Carbonet's geological team in collaboration with research institutes such as the University of Melbourne.
We develop and apply software, improving workflows for performance prediction and simulation-based design of CO2 geostorage. This is a model of a gravel pit, with a layered structure that is similar to that of storage targets buried in the subsurface. CO2 is injected on the left, migrating to the right, driven by the injection pressure. The ease with which fluid flows through rock is shown in grayscale. White is easy, black is hard. You can see that CO2 is channeled into central layers. Simultaneously, it rises because of its buoyancy. But capillary forces prevent it from entering fine-grained layers. The resulting CO2 migration pattern is really counterintuitive, illustrating the strong influence of varying rock properties on plume shape and CO2 retention by the layer. Such intricate behavior is not captured by conventional simulation software. We try to overcome this dilemma by developing next-generation software and applying it to more physically realistic models of storage pilots.
Here in the Carbon Capture Lab, we test, develop and provide support for the commercialisation of advanced solvent absorption systems for the separation of carbon dioxide from a variety of industrial gas streams. We have the laboratory tools, simulation models and pilot plan experience that enable the prediction of large-scale system performance from experimental and pilot plant data with a high degree of accuracy.
We collaborate with a large number of research project partners, One good example is our collaboration with the CO2 CRC, a member-based non-for-profit organization which develops and manages research activities at the CO2 CRC Otway site located in Western Victoria.
Many of the projects we work on explore ways of either enhancing the flow capacity to allow for higher CO2 injection rates or just the opposite, forming flow barriers to mitigate the risk of CO2 leakage. As an experimental geochemist, I conduct experiments using equipment that can replicate the pressure and temperature conditions found in the deep subsurface, so we can gain a better understanding of these processes.
This project is regarded as a starting point for commercial-scale hydrogen production, with carbon capture and storage coupled with hydrogen export.
Carbon capture and storage is a key climate mitigation technology which will enable industries and the economy to transition to a low-carbon world.
The Earth is Biosphere 1. This is Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 is an incredible tool in the hands of amazing scientists
that is dedicated to understanding the effects and impacts of global climate change.
To help us anticipate what are the possible responses of landscape-scale ecosystems to major changes in the dynamics associated with climate, particularly water and temperature.
So the consequences of global climate change, which the UN has already warned us about in the most explicit of ways, we can study here. And we can also think about how to ameliorate those consequences.
So the culmination of the changes of the climate over the past 3.5 decades I've been here are really coming to bear on us in very harsh terms right now.
When we think of the Earth, we think of Earth systems, all interplaying with each other. And that's precisely what happens here at Biosphere 2. You don't just look at a system in isolation, you can link them all together to see what happens.
The key is to be able to adapt. In order to be able to adapt, we have to understand what's coming our way. Without a facility like Biosphere 2, it makes some of those predictions much more difficult. But we really have an opportunity to provide insight in ways that other facilities can't, but very much complement the world's observatories and laboratories.
There's this incredible combination of the ability to do very large scale, yet controlled studies on uniquely controlled ecosystems. There is no place else like it in the world.
Some of the conditions that we currently see facing us, whether it's the increased temperature in coral reefs, the droughts in tropical forests, increased desertification, they're happening right now, and they're continuing to progress.
Well, here they are running those exact experiments to see how those systems will recover.
Each of these systems can be precisely controlled so that we can conduct experiments to understand the impacts of global climate change.
You go into a laboratory like B2 and you're saying, here are the factors that we think are driving this change. And we can then monitor those, or model or alter those parameters, CO2, temperature, et cetera, trace gas, other trace gases in the atmosphere, and then see what happens and see if indeed those changes in those parameters in the atmosphere in B2 translate to a change consistent with what we're seeing in the field.
Biodiversity loss is a true crisis. Emitting carbon into the atmosphere is a true existential crisis. If we don't do both of those at once, while maintaining some kind of equity or trying to make sure that what we do doesn't make inequities in the world worse, we are on our way.
Inside Biosphere 2 is a tropical ocean system. And what's unique about this is we can control all of the variables. We can control the temperature, we can control the water chemistry. And this system is different from your typical aquarium in that we are willing to push the boundaries of this system to understand the response of the organisms. And not just a single organism, but the entire community.
So unfortunately, as you all know, we are in really dire straits and at risk of losing our coral reefs entirely if we continue to do nothing about climate change. So today we've estimated to have lost already about 50% of the world's reefs. And so we're really at the point as a coral reef community where we need to really be moving into action. And so we have really developed innovative solutions for restoring what we call resilient reefs. So reefs that can persist through climate change and disturbances and may not look like the reefs of today, but will still provide that critical goods and services to humanity. Behind me is a really unique opportunity to actually test those solutions before they're applied in the wild. In my work, we've learned that corals that do get hit frequently by stress events, so they get warming frequently, tend to do better when these warm events return. So they then bleach less severely during subsequent events. So we can actually use that to our advantage and do something we call stress hardening, which is we turn up the temperature, we stress the corals out, and we increase their resistance to temperature stress. We can then restore the reefs with these stress-hardened corals, and those corals are more likely to survive subsequent heat stress events.
The Biosphere 2 rainforest is 35,000 cubic meters. It's 28 meters at its tallest point. It has over 100 plant species, and we can control every variable, from temperature to carbon dioxide to even the rain that's starting to come down right now.
I've been studying tropical rainforests for 20 years, mostly in the Amazon of Brazil, but also here in Biosphere 2. And these are fully assembled ecosystems. But what we really are able to do now in Biosphere 2 is to start from scratch, to build the Landscape Evolution Observatory, which allows us to assemble a complex ecosystem from scratch. And here we have the Landscape Evolution Observatory, LEO, our laboratory for understanding how ecosystems function.
So it rains in the mountains. How much water ends up downstream? What impacts the quality of that water? These are questions that we struggle with every day. The Landscape Evolution Observatory was specifically designed to try to shed light on some of those critical questions. As a landscape evolves, how does the movement of water change? As you add vascular plants, how does that further complicate the system? And can we actually develop tools that allow us to better predict, so people like water managers and city managers, for example, know how much water they're going to have as we move into the future?
The optimistic story is that biological systems are resilient, more resilient than we have often imagined, but that there is a limit to that resilience. And if we don't act soon to stop the changes that we're imposing on this globe and this planet, then we will lose the opportunity that biology is giving us to save it.
All around us, we've been able to see these different climate pressures show up in our natural ecosystems. And more, we're hearing about how climate change is impacting things that we need to live, the food that we want to eat, the water that we need to grow that food, and the energy for heating and cooling. In this system, I like to say we're harvesting the sun twice. In the overstory, we're collecting renewable energy, and it's providing shade for the plants growing below. The plants are growing in that shadier environment so they don't get that midday stress that really harms plants, really slows down their production. In exchange for that, just like we perspire and lose water and it cools off our skin, plants transpire, and that cooling of the atmosphere actually cools the solar panels overhead, which makes them even more efficient. And the last part of that is the shade in this environment reduces the evaporation of the moisture from the soil, which means the water stays in the ground longer and does the work that we brought it here to do, which is grow plants. One of the biggest benefits from agrivoltaics comes in terms of water savings. And we've found by growing food in this agrivoltaics environment, we can cut back half the water and still not see any impact in terms of the production. So what that tells me is that we can cut back more than half the water before we start to see real reductions. So we haven't even seen the full potential in terms of water savings. And so in terms of what's next, in our next spring growing season, we're gonna switch up our irrigation system and have it be plant driven. You know, when the plants draw down that soil moisture, our soil moisture sensors will detect that, and that will trigger the irrigation. That'll be the way that we actually calculate how much water does it take to sustain food in an agrivoltaic system versus a controlled system.
One of the important things is the question, is there hope? And I think The lesson from biology is, yes, biological systems are more resilient than we give them credit for, and we're learning all the ways in which biology has ways to cope with stresses and problems of climate change.
Biosphere 2 offers an opportunity to understand, first and foremost, what is the resiliency and the boundaries for some of these systems. But it also provides information of ultimately where are some of those tipping points.
And I have hope because I have seen reefs recover. I have seen evidence for reef recovery, but we need to give them that time by addressing climate change and coming together as a coral reef community to develop some of these solutions in real time.
There is absolutely hope. We are an adaptive species. We are seeing that the systems inside Biosphere 2 are showing us that in some cases they have greater resiliency than what we had initially anticipated. And because of that, that does give me hope. But just because we have hope does not mean that we can stop these efforts. We have to continue to forge forward and understand the implications. What are the resiliency and those boundary layers for these systems? Because knowing that is going to allow us to adapt and make changes to allow us to have long-term sustainability.
I have hope, and you should have hope, that the work that's being done here will be beneficial both to our generation and the next.
It gives the policymaker an opportunity to have additional information available to them that then in turn they can use to shape policy so that we don't reach those tipping points.
And no other time, I think, in Earth's humanity has that connection between the public and private sector and educational sector has been so important. Because the changes that are going to have to be made are going to be driven by policy and scaled up by business.
The question really is, how long will those solutions last? And can they be passed down to other generations? And we don't know the answers to those questions. And we don't know how these solutions will survive under future ocean conditions. And that's where the Biosphere 2 comes in, because we can actually simulate what oceans will experience, not just today, but 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future.
What I see right now that's important for us to be doing is to take that information, and B2 gives you a chance to do it. What does the basic science say? And how does it really translate to the real world? B2 is a step in that translational process. So I see B2 as a nice tool in the translational science.
We know the issues that we need to solve. We also know the issues are solvable.
The biosphere, it's like an icon of possibilities.
Where do we go from here? Well, the scientists will continue to experiment. They will continue to understand Earth systems. And at the end of the day, those experiments will inform the way that our governments, that our people, that we as citizens of Earth must steward Biosphere 1.